The following is an unofficial, unauthorized translation of the prophetic and predictive information provided to Billy Meier, when he was 11 years old, by Sfath. Meier was still known as Eduard at the time. The translation is by Matt and may be superseded by an official translation, when available. Excerpts from the contact discussion and predictions of Sfath, from Wednesday the 1st of September 1948.
Today I will recall you forthcoming times, which are also partly related to prophecies, but with regard to both, these will not be the last. Further predictions and prophecies will be given to you at later times by persons who, after my time, will keep the contacts with you. Today, however, I have a lot to declare and make known to you, in advance, what is going to happen until the end of 1963, which I have recorded in my notes through my own previews. Further predictions about the year 1963 and up to the year 2250, which I fathomed through foresight in the future, I have recorded in a total annuarium, which are, however, intended only for your knowledge and which you can request at a later time with those who will come after me. There are also predictions that you may reveal, but you must always decide on your own responsibility. According to the predictions, which I am giving to you today until the year 1963, I will give you a larger number of forecasts, which will be carried out by the second decade of the new millennium, but also to some extent still further into the future. A few definite predictions will be made more concrete, because these will be of particular importance in the coming times, but I will otherwise keep everything in a normal narrative framework and not openly explain in detail. Of course I will explain to you many of all the predictions after my remarks, but because I know that you, at a later time, request the records from my annals and publish these, I will hold back my discussion with regard to the explanations. If you still have special questions about the individual predictions, I will, of course, go into it and explain everything you need in detail.
Sometimes it is difficult for me to process all nasty predictions in such a way, just that it goes fast enough not to load me with it. Some awful things do to me, honestly said, sometimes already trouble, especially the horrible events that you make me see through time jumps, be it the various war crimes during the World War or the Copernic river break in 1933, etc. Sometimes it is really difficult, even if I have evil dreams.
I know that, but for the sake of your mission, it is necessary that you be aware of various past happenings, and also to be able to observe them directly. Only in this way will you be able to deal with everything in your life and fulfill your mission without harming yourself. Also, with regard to the predictions and prophecies, it is very important that you can process them in such a way that they do not burden you in the consciousness and in your thoughts and feelings, for which the reason is that in the performance of your mission very much evil will come to you, which you must process, so that you cannot burden yourself with everything and do your work. It is a difficult task to learn this, which will also make you very strong and unencumberable for all kinds of adversities, such as hostility by adversaries, liars, know-it-alls, and slanderers, to whom you will be exposed as a result of your mission time of your life. And this will also be the case in your family from the moment you marry in Greece in 18 years, and will witness a daughter and 2 sons within 7 years, because your marriage will be very vicious, even if you have to experience it for the fulfillment of your mission, because this will be another multiplier for your strength and will be necessary. It will be very difficult for you, however, because this connection will put you very heavily on account of strife and betrayal, before the relationship is ended by divorce at the end of the century. This will not mean the end of evil, for after the dissolution of the marriage, the lies and calumnies will go on against you from your former life companion, to which your daughter and the youngest son will be joined. The oldest son, however, will not act against you, but will leave the family and go his own ways. But after a few years he will seek your help and return to you, and from then on will find helpful and cooperative to your mission. And this will arise in the last decade of this century and in the first decade of the new millennium.
What you say does not look like a happy life.
You will nevertheless make your life enjoyable and joyful, because you will dedicate yourself with joy, vigor, good courage and great labor tirelessly to your mission and make them a passion for you. This inclination will give you all the necessary strength, joy, peace and harmony so that you will always be satisfied in every situation, be it happiness or grief. In addition, all that you have to work through the predictions of every kind brought to you, and will learn from it more and understand than it will be possible for a person. But you shall not be envied, for you will be so burdened throughout your life, and through all doctrines, that you can hardly endure and bear it, if you cannot grow out of yourself, which often requires your very last strength.
You always tell me things that are happy and uplifting, that sometimes I almost feel like a kicked dog. My reason, however, always tells me that it has to be, and that without all that I have to learn, I cannot grasp my task and not carry it out. In addition, I can always relax and look forward, if you bring me somewhere, where beautiful landscapes, where flowers and other plants, birds and animals in the jungles, etc. are. Also the volcanoes in different countries that you have let me see, as well as the volcanic black smoke chimneys in the deep sea and the red volcanoes, the diversity of the smallest and largest aquatic organisms, as well as the many other things you do to me again and again, as well as all the important and knowledgeable things that you teach me over and over again, completely compensate me, so that my sometimes somber thoughts of getting kicked out quickly disappear, which is indeed the purpose of the exercise, I think.
With which you are right, for I know how you have responded to everything, since your birth, since I have studied you, your being and all your emotions, and therefore know what is good for you. But also later, when I am no longer, you will not have to miss these excursions, because after me too, you will be given the opportunity to do so. And in this studied way, I act, as you have taken this kind of from me, and act out of your own accord in the same way, if you find it necessary to keep you and your mood in good shape. Therefore, sit down and write precious books, essays or articles, as well as sayings and poems, or you will lead profound conversations with some people. But now I will come to the predictions which I have to tell you. Many changes in politics and space technology will bring major changes throughout the world over the coming decades, but only a few important facts will be mentioned, because hundreds of other incidents and events would go beyond the scope of the predictions too much. Therefore, in the first place, I will only mention the most important events and occurrences in the series. I shall show some things only annually until 1963, and will also explain in more detail the different remarks. I will begin with the coming year 1949, when Jerusalem is called to be the Israeli capital, India as a member of the Commonwealth, and China to the People's Republic of China, according to which North and South Korea are recognized as independent states. And next year, 1949, will also be an organization by name NATO, which will be the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which will then be the Organization of a North Atlantic Treaty. It will be founded on the grounds that the signatory states want to create a military alliance of defense which is to become a community of values of Western states for protection from the Soviet Union. Then an official friendship between the Soviet Union and China will be proclaimed. In 1952, a great deal of political activity will take place, which will bring about various twists and turns. A so-called European defense community is established, and then 2 Swedish Air Force machines are shot down over the Baltic Sea in Swedish neutral territory by Soviet fighter aircraft, resulting in several deaths and political differences, however will not lead to war. In the same year, the US will bomb North Korea, which will be subject to an evil dictatorship until the new millennium, and then carry out atomic tests under a new dictator and threats against the USA. And all those who are offended with the North Korean dictatorships will not agree. In Egypt, King Farouk will be deposed by a military coup, and then also King Talal by the military. Then Great Britain will light the first atomic bomb on an Australian island, which will then follow the first hydrogen bomb test in an atoll in the Pacific. There is only one important event to be mentioned in 1953, with the death of the Soviet dictator, Joseph Stalin, after which there will then be another individual event in 1954, a mutual defense agreement between the USA and Taiwan. In 1955, however, there will be no process of de-Stalinization, while in the US, with balloons and pamphlets, aggressive and provocative action will be taken against the policies of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union through protests and many media. Then the Soviet Union in Kazakhstan will also be an explosive atomic bomb, and then there will be an armed conflict between Egypt on the one hand and an alliance of Great Britain, France and Israel on the other. Then a guerrilla war begins against the dictator Fulgencio Batista in Cuba, who will be overthrown and replaced by a rebel leader. In 1957, the Soviet Union will test a first intercontinental rocket, as will the first satellite. Sputnik will be put in the Earth orbit, by which the US will be shocked, so they begin a race to be the first to land on the moon, for which all means will be right. In 1958, a European Economic Community, as well as a European Investment Bank, will be set up, while in Switzerland a regular television broadcasting will begin. After that, Egypt and Syria are united as the United Arab Republic. At the same time, the US will put its first satellite into Earth orbit, and with an atomic submarine, the American Navy will cross the North Pole, where a worldwide space organization called NASA will be formed in the US, while the countries Tunisia and Morocco will join the so-called Arab League. After this, a state of siege is established in Pakistan, after which a military dictatorship is established. In 1959, the Soviet Union will send a satellite to the moon, while the United States of America will use Alaska as a satellite 49th state in the community of states, and Hawaii will be granted its own statehood. A Soviet probe will reach the moon and crush on it. Another Soviet rocket will be launched to circle the moon. 3 weeks later, the Pakistani city of Rawalpindi is proclaimed as the new capital of the Republic of Pakistan at the foot of the Himalayas, followed by a popular uprising in Lhasa against the Chinese occupation of Tibet, which has been defeated and annexed by China, and the 14th Dalai Lama India will flee. For the year 1960, the importance of replacing the name of the South American capital of Brazil, Rio de Janeiro, and giving it a new capital called Brasilia, will be mentioned. a nuclear law will enter into force for the peaceful use of nuclear energy. Then the first U.S. nuclear submarine will be commissioned, which will also be equipped with medium-range missiles. Then follows a series of independent grants, such as the African country of Eastern Cameroon, the Republic of Niger, the Republic of Gabon, and Obervolta, which will be renamed Burkina Faso in 1984, then also to Madagascar, République de France Côte d'Ivoire, the Republic of Chad, the Central African Republic, the Republic of Congo, Mauritania, Senegal, Nigeria and Togo, as well as British Somaliland and Belgian Zaire, etc. Also the British Cypriot becomes independent, the southern Somalia also becomes independent, and Italian Somalia, whereby Somaliland and Italian Somalia then unite to Somalia. In Indonesia, the party's activities will be emphatically restricted. In Morocco and Chile, heavy earthquakes will occur, which will claim many thousands of dead. A U.S. espionage aircraft of the U-2 type is shot down over Sverdlovsk by Soviet forces. This is announced later. A secret espionage aircraft from the U.S. will be shot down over the Soviet Union by Soviet military forces. Then the Turkish military will enact a putsch against the government, according to which the state's chief will be executed. In Baghdad, a grouping of net oil exporting countries with similar political interests, an organization for economic cooperation is established, aka Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries or OPEC, to the founding countries of Iraq, Iran, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia as well as Venezuela will be included. A European Organization for Air Navigation Services is set up in Europe, as is an Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development Aid. In the autumn of 1961, Soviet and GDR organizations of the People's Police and the National Army will, together with groups of operations, block the border with West Germany with barbed wire, but soon a wall of hollow blocks and concrete piles will be built. Thereafter, the year 1962 will bring some unpleasantness, beginning with the division of the city of Berlin into East and West Berlin. After the next year, that is 1949, the German Democratic Republic, respectively, GDR, and divide Germany into two states for about 40 years, until 1989, which will claim many dead people, because they want to escape from the GDR. A Soviet interference against West Berlin air traffic will then be carried out. In Yemen, the monarchy is overthrown by the army and a republic is called out. This year, too, several countries will become independent, while the Soviet Union is deploying medium-range missiles to Cuba, which will lead to dangerous confrontations with the U.S. The stationed missiles will be removed after hard negotiations, with the result that the Cuban crisis will end. In India, Chinese military will penetrate the state area, which will lead to an Indo-Chinese border war. In 1963, a military uprising will take place in Paraguay and the dictator will be deposed. Western New Guinea will be part of the Asian Republic of Indonesia. The Soviet Union will launch a manned space capsule, which will remain in orbit for 5 days and will circling about 80 times around the world. In Moscow, an agreement between the Soviet Union, Great Britain and the USA is reached with regard to a ban on nuclear weapons testing in the atmosphere, in space and underwater. The Kingdom of Singapore, which is dependent on Great Britain, will become independent. In the US, the president will be assassinated by an assassination attempt. In Iraq, a coup of the Iraqi Arab Socialist Ba'ath Party will lead to the overthrow of the government. Within the Indian Union, the Nagaland region becomes a separate federal state. Only these facts, which have so far been mentioned, will greatly alter the picture of the world and lead to serious consequences for the third millennium. Even since the beginning of the World War in 1914, the natural and plant and animal world, and particularly in the Arctic and Antarctic as well as on all continents of the world, as well as degenerations caused by irresponsible maneuvers of the more and more overbearing humanity of the Earth, as well as in the coming time and into the third millennium, unusual and disturbing changes across the planet. From this point onwards, the climate will change as a result of the immensely growing overpopulation, along with a new migration of poles, which has been begun on Earth several hundred years ago, which affects animals in their magnetic orientation, marine life, which are dying because they lose their orientation and are then stranded. The pole shifts will lead to a tropical climate, where a cold or temperate climate still prevails, while where heat prevail, the cold, but also moderate zones will spread. And this will, on the one hand, be the result of all the criminal activity of men, which, by the exploitation of the Earth, and by atomic bomb tests, which will continue to a new millennium, will alter the interior of the Earth and cause Earth shifts. Migration is contributing to these changes. The migration is, however, not the real evil, but the irresponsible interventions in nature, in the planets themselves, as well as in the plant and natural world of creatures. The great thing is produced solely by the destructive action of mankind, with regard to the whole impairment of all life, and with regard to climatic disturbances, which will result in unexpected natural catastrophes. Consequently, by the guilt of earthly humanity, nature and the worlds of water, as well as the plant and animal worlds, are affected in their way of life and their existence, but they are also killed, destroyed, and made extinct by many kinds of poisons. In this way many living things will die and be exterminated in the coming times. The exploitation of the geological treasures changes the geographic characteristics of the Earth, and the earth shifts of the Earth's plates gradually appear, causing tremendous earthquakes and volcanic eruptions in all parts of the world, causing the death of hundreds of thousands of people and the destruction of the Earth. Also through many wars and terror millions of people's lives and many valuable antiquities are irrevocably destroyed. As a result of the long-standing polar migration, the Bermuda Triangle, a region north of the Caribbean, which lies between the island of Bermuda, a British overseas area in the Atlantic Ocean, and the coast of Florida, shows that this is beginning to increase in the early days, which will expand into the coming times and far into the third millennium. Likewise, it happens with the counterpart Dragon Triangle in the Devil's Sea, in an area in the Pacific, about 100 kilometers south of Tokyo/Japan at Miyake Island. The Dragon Triangle and the Bermuda Triangle are considered places where ships and aircraft disappear under mysterious circumstances. The peculiarity of the two triangles is that, on the one hand, both are at the same latitude and are almost at opposite points, but where so-called ghost ships are also found in both areas. In the world's oceans, the monster waves, the Three Sisters and the White Walls will also increase in the future thanks to a climate crisis which has already begun, and which has proceeded very rapidly, and the polar migration that has also been going on for several centuries. The monster waves, that is megavellas, which have appeared frequently since the oceans existed, can reach a height of more than 30 meters, and even tear large ocean waves into the depths. by vast tempests and the rising of the sea level as a result of the melting of the poles. Many parts of the landscapes of many countries, as well as the coasts of sea-bound states, are destroyed, both in Europe and in the East, to the Bering Sea, Africa, Asia, America, Australia, China, India, Japan, Canada, New Zealand, South America and Tasmania. It will also be in the time to come that by means of inward movements, and in the Atlantic and the Pacific many new lands are pushed up. And where the coasts of many countries are still today, the seas will penetrate the land with their waters, and will irrevocably destroy and devour many human achievements, just as much life of all kinds will commit death. Many of the water of streams, rivers and lakes will be drained by the water screw which mankind will use to irrigate infertile soil for the sake of food production, but this will in many cases contribute radically to climate change. In addition, large areas of fertile cultivated land are being destroyed in all countries of the world, because less and less space remains for the growing overpopulation, which will require more and more residential buildings, roads, paths and factories, etc., by misuse of the cultivated land. And to be able to move, all kinds of traffic will be further developed in the coming times, which will, however, always be too fast to be able to cope with the immensely increasing traffic volume. Thus, however, and ever more new roads and railways must be built. The advent of transport vehicles of all kinds will reach unimaginable proportions, so that at the beginning of the third millennium billions of vehicles will overload and clog the roads, but this will become much more extensive as the overpopulation grows in the future. As the entire road and rail transport on the earth will grow in a frightening way, this will soon also result with satellites in the near and further space, which are coming from hundreds of satellites and tens of thousands of missiles and others into the orbit, as in a few decades, space stations will circle around the Earth. The beginning will take place over the next 2 decades when efforts are made to get into the near-terrestrial space and bring rockets and vehicles to the Earth's moon. In 1961, for the first time, the Soviet Union would bring a manned space capsule into the orbit and then again make a successful landing possible. In the coming years, unmanned and remote-controlled vehicles will be brought to the moon, both from the US and from the Soviet Union. There will then be a race between the US and the Soviet Union on the moon, which will be successful in the USA towards the end of 1969, as well as several times after. But, for the time being, a great deception will be made to the whole, by showing a victory and advance in front of the Soviet Union with a fictitious and moon-landed film, which is filmed on the Earth. The alleged astronauts are so hypnotically influenced that they believe they have actually fulfilled the lunar mission, while many employees are put to fraud under drugs and hypnosis, and everything is forgotten. So ultimately only 3 people really have the knowledge of the fraud, and these will be silent. In 1971, a so-called World Economic Forum, WEF, is set up as a foundation in the Swiss canton of Geneva, which will give the people a lot of turmoil and annoyance. In this forum, leading international economists, politicians, intellectuals and journalists will meet to discuss current global economic, health and environmental policy issues, and to create a comprehensive globalization. This will not be harmless, because globalization, which will be striven for and achieved, will bring life forms of all genera and species into other countries in a few years, displacing and eradicating indigenous forms of life. These will be amphibians, fish, mammals, insects, animals, plants, reptiles and birds of various genera and species, but all sorts of diseases and epidemics as epidemics, endemias and pandemics will begin to spread throughout the world. As early as 1957, 1958, a virus influenza epidemic will claim around 2 million deaths worldwide. Another virus pandemic will follow in 1968 and continue until 1970. In the 1979 Soviet Union, there is an anthrax epidemic, with a total of around 350 people being killed. In 1980, an immunodeficiency pandemic will erupt, about which 39 million people will die around the world by 2020. In 2000, Canada will be affected by a small epidemic caused by contaminated drinking water. 2002 and 2003 will be the years of a pandemic which will claim around 1,000 people's lives worldwide. A swine flu will follow in 2009 and 2010, causing the death of around 20,000 people, while in the same year a plague will erupt in South America and spread to large parts of Latin America and other countries by 2015 and beyond, with thousands of dead. In the same year, the plague is spreading again and calls for about 600 dead. And later in 2014 the plague in Madagascar will call for further death sacrifices. Haiti will be haunted by cholera from 2010, which then claims many thousands of people's lives, according to which a small epidemic will cost around 60 people in northern Germany in 2011. In 2013, a small epidemic will be killing some people in Europe, while in Central America about 1 million people will have an epidemic of fever and a few hundred will die of it. In 2014, an epidemic will then erupt in West Africa, which will claim around 14,000 lives, but can only be temporarily reduced. In 2015, this epidemic will once again be felt in many Latin American countries, as it has already occurred in 2009 and 2010. However, diseases and epidemics continue to spread over the years.
I have to conceal this data, because it is not intended to spread fear and fright through premature predictions.
Radical extremism and civil rebellion in many countries will lead to bloody uprisings, civil wars and religious and sectarian terrorism in the coming times, with Libya, Egypt, Turkey, Iraq and Syria in the focus of all rebellious and murderous evils in the new millennium. The earth will break up in many parts, and England and a large part of Japan will be devoured by the sea, but the northern part of Europe will also be profoundly altered and uninhabitable. Thus a new order of the planet will be established, and a purification will take place in the high governments and their lower offices, because the peoples will stand up against them, and will demand that they should be given greater consideration, and the individual people and their concerns are taken seriously. Political, economic, and other conditions will appear in this way and through other specific circumstances, which will lead to a better equality and a greater understanding for and among each other, as well as for the needs of the individual. With all the upheavals and changes that will come inevitably, which is absolutely certain, revolutionary evolution is unprecedented in all technical, medical and all other scientific fields, which will lead to a very long-lasting, rapid development period, which is an immeasurably great and rapid progress in all areas. This is contrary to religious thought which, driven by the great and far-reaching anxiety of the world's population, has led to a new religious and sectarian faith as a result of many events of war and terrorism, will fall. Many will turn away from their religions because they become truthful, but they indifferently, without a religious affinity, indulge their false faith, have fallen from childhood, and cannot free themselves from it. In their beliefs, they will also be averse to lying politics and thus foster the dissatisfaction of the world, especially in America and in Europe, where a dictatorship union will emerge and together with America will unite hostilities against the Soviet Union, which in 1991 will be called Russia. This emerging Russia will be the basis for a widespread peace, but a Russian armament against the dictatorship union in Europe and America may break out because they are irresponsible and in a destructive way create warring machinations against Russia. But Russia will end communism and look for peaceful values all around the world, against America and the dictatorship union in Europe. At the very least, however, from 1998 onwards, a series of peaceful and sensible politicians will show that there are many efforts and good activities to bring about gradual political changes to the good. But all of the opposing members of the dictatorship union in Europe and America, who want not peace but dissatisfaction, in order to be able to satisfy their claims to war in other countries. As a result, the period will come when, as a result of the provocation by the dictatorship union in Europe and America against Russia, the danger of a further world-encompassing war will again grow if the restrained and peace-striving Russia might nevertheless force itself into a truce, which is not yet fathomed in the future, and corresponds to a prophecy, which cannot yet be said whether one or no catastrophic activity will appear in this period. Human life, however, will go on, regardless of whether or not a further global war will affect the Earth's humanity, as well as the changes in the Earth caused by the migration of the poles. The whole of what is still uncertain cannot be misinterpreted, for every prophecy can be changed by means of action in reason and with understanding in such a way that it does not have to fulfill itself, but can change itself to the better and the better. All effects are built up over years, decades, and centuries, but the event that results from a prophecy is always determined according to the rational or unreasonable action of men, thus in good or evil respectively, in positive or negative. But what comes to be by means of pure, natural processes and events will inevitably be because man cannot be influenced if the course of events has already crossed the zenith in which human influence can no longer be influenced. And that is precisely the case when until the coming millennium the Earth's population does not listen to the prophetic and predictive warnings and continues in its destruction. And in this respect the unstoppable growth of overpopulation must be mentioned first, but in the end, all that is destroyed by the overpowering mass of earthly humanity on planet Earth, nature, the plant world, and the world of all living creatures, in crushing and exterminating ways irresponsibly. These predictions, which are also mentioned several times in repetitive fashion with regard to the events which have already been said, are all very important. In principle, they show that their fulfillment will be unavoidable, whereby they will take effect in the coming ages until well into the third millennium, and will bring about great upheavals. Firstly, unprecedented prosperity will arise in all population strata, which will also lead to great wealth. This will entail that for many people vast wealth becomes a living content, consequently they are rich in wealth and become many millionaires and billionaires through all kinds of crime and gambling. And all this will entail that fraudsters, other criminals, and all sorts of financial jugglers deceive many innocent people from various social strata by dozens and hundreds of millions of Swiss francs, D-marks, and dollars, and bring the deceived to the beggary. Bankers will also join in with these frauds and cash out horrendous remunerations in millions, as will the banks themselves. Lies and fraud, as never before, will have a great impact, as will family deaths with many death sacrifices, as in schools, etc., by psychologically disturbed perpetrators, as well as by terrorist assassinations in public events and gatherings of peoples. Through the coming wealth in all population strata, people become egotistic, selfish, and greedy as never before, whereby crime and violent crimes will also increase to a high degree. All the rules of the good and the right will be viciously spoiled and abused in the coming decades and far into the new millennium, with innumerable people abandoning all their good intentions, thereby evacuating anarchistic machinations, and particularly youth and middle age. Very much of the good, the positive and the righteous, as well as the correct behaviors, are ignored by the coming generation, no longer learned and forgotten, as well as much of progress, learning, and general knowledge, as well as real peace, freedom, harmony, love, as well as compassion for fellow human beings, nature and their world of plants and all forms of life. There will be a more and more extensive cowardice and indifference among earthly human beings, which will degenerate in a frightening degree, so that people are drugged, tortured, beaten, whipped, raped, and even killed without the help of others hurriedly, but only inactive. Many young people, children and adolescents, suffer from indifference, lack of compassion, and the lack of thought and feeling, because their human feeling and thinking, as well as the sum of all the qualities of consciousness and personality, are lost in them, even to the loss of the most precious, namely, the understanding and the reason. They will also be lacking in real vitality, in particular all self-perceptible individual phenomena or formations of their own vitality and vivacity. The majority of young people will depend on luxury in the coming years until well into the new millennium, will only behave with bad manners and despise any authority. They will despise the decency and respect, as well as themselves, as well as before the old people, the authorities, the police, and the fellow men in general. They will no longer work, but will only want to live dishonestly about what others are doing in a righteous way. The majority of young people, even children, will contradict their parents and teachers and tyrannize them while they behave remarkably badly in society. And all this evil behavior is preserved up to the time of middle age, and consequently also 30 and 40-year-olds will still behave in these ways. In addition, hallucinogenic drugs will be abused, making drug addiction a daily occurrence, and the young people, as well as older ones, will no longer be able to do any work and will be prone to schizophrenia. In addition, these types of juveniles are often criminally poor and must be fed, nursed and maintained by society. The values of life will be forgotten by many people in the times to come or deliberately trampled, as is also the fall from all morality, and even a moral corruption to open whoredom, whereby everything quickly becomes a state-approved, open and tax-paying whoredom. And this whoredom will become a pleasure for innumerable people of both sexes, who also exercise it, and also involve children of all ages, because the sexual abuse of children will take over the world. And this whoredom will grow all over the world, because the coming electronic possibilities of information will open up all the gates, and all the whores and child abusers will be able to communicate with each other, to make arrangements and to make their shameless work. And everything will be as it has never before appeared, and even the legend of Sodom and Gomorrah will be surpassed. From the last, respectively the Third World War, which raged between 1939 and 1945. Radical extremist groupings have already emerged in Nazi mania, which will spread worldwide in the coming years, beginning in Germany and spreading across Europe. Also in the USA, Russia and other countries will become more active. Murderous terrorist organizations will also emerge, especially in Arab and fascist Asia, as well as directly Asian countries. The fact that the terrorists are trained tone fighters themselves, and then, with all necessary weapons, etc. American intelligence and warfare in the United States is also a source of disaster for many countries on the earth, through warfare and destruction, which will be instigated by American military and purchased mercenaries in the coming decades until well into the third millennium. There will also be other great, dreadful wars, even after the end of the war, which ended and ends in 1945, in Asian countries, where the French Foreign Legion, as well as the Americans, cause monstrous inhumanities. From 1978 onwards, there will be a state of conflict lasting until the third millennium in Afghanistan. From 2001 onwards, the U.S. will intervene in the war and fight a terrorist organizer, which will be killed in the second decade by a special ceremony of a special unit of terrorist leaders. In 1979 there will be a war between Iraq and Persia on the Persian Gulf, in which the U.S. will also interfere. In 1990, dictatorial Iraq will attack and annex Kuwait, which will be a reason for the U.S. to invade Iraq in 1991 and lead to a bloody and destructive war. In the third year after the turn of the millennium, another major war in Iraq will take place in the United States, where American troops will invade and emerge as a victorious occupying force and will also execute the dictator. This war will also call for many dead people and bring about great destruction. The United States and especially its two irresponsible U.S. presidents, father and son, will be responsible for both wars. Everything will come about as a result of unsustainable and irresponsible lies on the part of the two presidents, as well as the secret services, which consequently have to bear the debt. From then on, endless religious beliefs and murders will reign in the regions there, as well as in Syria. Through America's guilt, an Islamist-formed terrorist organization of unimaginable brutality and cruelty will emerge, whose terrorist acts, which are murderously imprisoned, cause fear and fright all over the world, even throughout Europe. The murderous deeds of this terrorist organization will be carried out by fanatics and globally by adventure-seeking, misguided, criminals, stupid people and gangsters who have been bloody for years, torturing people, massacring women and girls, kidnapping people, as well as countless beheadings and other given brutal and bestial deaths. The great terrorist organizations that are emerging in the coming decades, which are caused by the U.S. intelligence and war crimes, but which will also be hypocritical, will originate in Arab countries and will spread around the world, as well as diverse later terrorist organizations, which also result from the criminal military and secret services of the United States of America, and will also claim many dead in several countries of Europe and also in the USA. Also, terrorist organizations otherwise originate also in Europe, where, especially, radically right-wing terror groupings will drive up an anarchistic, as well as foreign hostile and race hostile, dreadful state of affairs far in the third millennium. The United States promotes, as since time immemorial, also in times to come, through its criminal political and intelligence intrigue and government infiltration and military warlike interventions throughout the world, strife, hatred, terror, torture, war, murder, assassinations, destruction and devastation. Through their misunderstandings, the U.S. is not spared even by the emergence of terrorism, especially when in the first year of the third millennium, New York is hit by heavy terrorist attacks and thousands of dead will have to be deplored. But such events will be repeated in the course of the years. In many instances, therefore, the worldwide terrorism will be due to the guilt of America and demand unspeakable suffering and destruction throughout the world. The terrorism arising in the next decades and in the new millennium will have unimagined consequences, which can no longer be solved, or can only be partially solved by the most severe military operations and struggles. Even unpolitical terrorist and criminal organizations, which have existed or newly emerged for many decades, cannot be resolved by violent police and military operations. All of these worldwide and transnational terrorist and criminal organizations of various kinds will go to tens of thousands of youthful and middle-aged, misguided, labor-shy, adventurous and criminal people because they indiscreetly and willingly indoctrinate themselves in order to carry out crimes, miserable and criminal acts, to attack, torture, as well as to commit terrible death, to commit rape and to spread corruption. Many people are being overthrown to terrorist and criminal organizations because the political machinations in their own homeland become more and more hostile to the people, which makes the population harassed and undermined by the political co-right to justice. The resulting injustice and the resulting displeasure will be the causes of bourgeoisie dissatisfaction, which will then also be intervened against the governments, leading to violent demonstrations and deaths. That will also be in the course of time, as the European Union, headquartered in Belgium, is going to establish a dictatorship union, which the European states will unhesitatingly follow as a result of the dictator's lies. This dictatorship, as it will come, will be governed by ruthless rulers, and sneakily endeavored to bring all European states under their power. The dictatorship, however, will also strive to extend its power to the countries of the former Europe, through alliances, to revive Western hostility towards Russia, as it has been a long time since. And in this respect, the U.S. will be the first and strongest allies with the dictatorship union, and thus, if the Cold War ended in 1991, which was triggered by the Western powers after the war in 1945, would do anything to prevent the Cold War, to revive and to incite the new Russia to provoke warlike actions. But in the US and in the dictatorship union in Europe, and in Russia will also be peace-minded people who will seek to prevent evil, but this will lead to questionable political actions. In the future, all this, as well as refugee flows, wars and terrorism, will lead to dissatisfaction and hatred among the peoples, as well as to religious and sectarian, racial hatred, especially in the new millennium, to be very strong. And this will come especially from the year 2005 onwards, through a confused woman in Germany, who will send refugees to Europe from poorly armed and war-stricken countries, like from Africa, Arabia and Asia. Among the real refugees, however, will be many labor crimes, criminals, and terrorists, who will do much evil in the European countries. This woman, conscious of the power of conscience, will also be responsible for many of the evils caused in Europe by criminals, rapists and terrorists, both in Germany and in other European countries, in the 1990s of a dictatorship union. This will not be powerful, but this will not be recognized even by specialists. Consequently, they will undoubtedly drive their mischief, and will be praised by their inexperienced followers. And this will also be the case if she will act foolishly against the new Russia, which will emerge from the Soviet Union about a decade before the millennium change. In her further power, the ruler will provoke undreamed of refugees from Africa, Arabia and Asia in total irrationality, as a result of which millions of refugees from underdeveloped third world countries and from war zones will migrate to Europe, leading to great problems and also to many criminals, and criminal as well as terrorist acts. But their stupid supporters do not recognize this, nor does it mean that the entire politicians who are on their side and advocate them do not recognize the true political problems, which is why many of them will not recognize the entire problem of refugees. In principle, they will all be selfish, self-governing, self-obsessed and incapable, failing to recognize the truth and the precarious refugee situation, and will simply ignore the fact that thousands of truthful and false refugees are on their way to life in Europe. The responsible politicians, who are on the side of the German ruler, will let them go and help them, so that the woman will not be held accountable for all the many refugees who will be responsible. From the year 2009 onwards, an African-American president will lead the American government until 2017, who in the first period will be widely respected by the majority of the population and may also generate a great deal of hope, but this will change and as a result he cannot prevail against his advisors and adversaries. Consequently, the majority of his former advocates will be against him. He will first be a good governor and also try to fulfill his plans and promises, but he will not succeed in his entire presidency because he is unable to assert himself against his false advisors and adversaries, thus ultimately leading to failure and to becoming a traitor to himself. As a very good man, he will come to the presidency, but gradually he will fall prey to the influence of his opponents and act according to their false and hostile directives, because he will be too inexperienced and too weak for his office and will fail. From the 1980s onwards, there will be global unemployment, which will continue for decades to a great extent in the new millennium, and will bring a lot of hardship, misery and crime, as well as inflation, as well as many private, family, state and corporate debts, which makes companies, private people, families and countries illiquid, bankrupt, as well as banks going into bankruptcy. This will be linked to the fact that trade unions are increasingly and more often organized for workers' strikes, thereby calling on employers to pay ever higher wages to the workers. The higher wages will result in a higher standard of living, as it will also be seen that foodstuffs and the entire cost of living and all kinds of goods of all kinds are becoming ever more expensive and become unaffordable for poorer people. It will also be the time when, in the civilized industrialized countries, the young people quickly become demoralized, become more unintelligent, have no control over their thoughts and feelings, fall victim to serious psychological and reactive psychosis, and they also suffer from depression and symptoms of schizophrenia, as well as mania and anxiety disorders, and other psychotic problems. This will spread more and more in the new millennium, which is why it will be necessary for you to write a book that will be a great help to all those who will strive to study your book. Worldwide, the value of money will fall very low, which will be the case especially in Europe through the introduction of a dictatorship union currency. This currency will drive some member states of the dictatorship union into unimagined, horrendous debts, which are to be compensated for by further financial indebtedness. Thus state mismanagement will emerge as a result of state mismanagement, whereas in other countries this can be prevented in many cases only by state financial aid. The same will happen in the case of various large banks, which operate through economically insane as well as financial economics, and continue to exist only through financial state subsidies. And then, if the greasy domestic politics of the dictatorship union continue to be transformed into foreign policy and the agitation against Russia is strengthened, this could ultimately provoke Russia to a turmoil against the dictatorship union in Europe and the USA. If this were to be done according to an old prophecy, the dictatorship of the European dictatorship would rather be annihilated than it would dissolve itself as a result of instability and quarrels among the member states. This could also mean, as the same prophecy states, that Europe would then be pacified through Russia, which could also spread over the world. With regard to today's predictions, these will now be the last, with the emerging events being aligned all around the world, so on Europe, Australia, Asia, Africa and the entire American continent. On the American continent much will be destroyed in a long time, for the Great Caldera will be broken, which cannot be prevented either, or the breaking up of the earth by the Great Eiffel Caldera in Germany, whereby the upper part of Europe becomes a fire sea. Other countries will also undergo great changes, with, for example, a large part of Japan will sink into the sea, as the northern coasts of Europe are swept away by wild floods. In front of the east coast of America, in the Atlantic and the Pacific, islands are lifted from the waters, and New York and parts of the coast are destroyed, while in the South Seas great upheavals are taking place. But also in the south of Europe, the all-pervasive consequences will be enormous, when the volcanoes of Mount Etna, Vesuvius and Stromboli as well as the submarine largest active volcano of Europe, the volcano Mount Marsili before Italy, together with about 24 submarine volcanoes in the Mediterranean begin. The caldera, respectively the supervolcan Phlegrean Fields in Italy is already making itself felt more and more in order to tear the earth in the distant future. In Italy and Sicily alone there are 24 dangerous mainland, island and submarine volcanoes, 3 of which are caldera areas, which will cause much disaster in the coming times. The fact that the vast majority of the active volcanoes are of submarine nature and active are not yet known to the general public, because these largely unknown underwater volcanoes, which enter the earth on the earth, never break through the surface of the water. A whole ring of such underwater volcanoes lies on the peaks of the longest mountain chain in the world, the Middle Ocean Ridge, which is still not known to the people of Earth. Particularly from the year 2001, the southern Italian volcanoes are particularly active. In 2002, the Stromboli and 2003 of Mount Etna will show great activities arranged in a zone in which the African and the European earth plate collide. In the new millennium, greater activities will also take place in Vesuvius in Italy, as well as large volcanic activities on the southwest coast of South America, and especially on Sumatra and other areas in Indonesia. However, particularly severe sea quakes worldwide will lead to huge, many-meter-high tidal waves that will cause a lot of disaster and claim tens of thousands of death victims, which will be the case especially in the first 2 decades of the new millennium and will last until 2015 will be terminated. Everything will continue in an increasing framework, the sign of which will be great earthquakes in central Italy, which will be the stage of the beginning of the fulfillment of those events which will lead many catastrophes, much disaster, suffering, distress, misery and destruction over the earth. In the new millennium, by 2015, the development will be announced by a large number of earthquakes and seaquakes, which will claim hundreds of thousands of people's lives, which will not be prevented by earthly humanity. And that there will be so many dead, which in the distant future will be many more, will be possible only because of the surpassing of the rapidly growing and overbearing overpopulation of earthly humanity. However, until the beginning of the coming really great natural catastrophes, starting from the new millennium, and especially from the year 2015 onwards, earthly humanity will no longer alter the coming disastrous events, and they will no longer do so. Thousands of small, medium and large seaquakes and earthquakes will shatter the earth. All these natural disasters are self-inflicted by earthly humanity as a result of their irrationality and all their destroying machinations on the planet, nature, the entire plant and water world, as well as all their living creatures. In the first year of the new millennium, on the 1st of January 2001, the area of Mindanao in the Philippines will be shaken by very strong seaquakes, which will be followed by the island group Vanuatu in the South Pacific only about a week later, but in both cases without death sacrifice will expire. A week later, however, El Salvador is affected, with about 1,000 death victims to be lamented, after which a very severe earthquake will then claim around 22,000 lives in India. And in the new millennium, dozens of earthquakes around the world will take place worldwide every year, which will make speeches, which however will require no or only a few dead. In other serious sea and earthquakes, however, many people's lives are to be deplored, as in 2006, with about 100 deaths in Iran, and again in Java in 2006, where 6,500 deaths will be expected. Solomon Islands by seaquake, about 110 people will die. Another heavy quake will also take place at Chincha Alta, which belongs to Peru, with the death of about 620 people, followed by Sumatra with 36 deaths, and then the Congo with 67 deaths. In 2008, China will make speeches with a very serious earthquake, which will result in the deaths of some 91,000 people. This is followed by Japan with 16 deaths, which in the same year will affect Pakistan with about 210 deaths. In 2009, Costa Rica will have 44 casualties, according to which a year-long series of earthquakes will announce in the same year in central Italy a coming catastrophe that will claim some 300 lives. Then, again in 2009, Indonesia is again about 90, Bhutan with 15 and Indonesia with 1,200 deaths. This is followed by the year 2010, when Haiti will be affected by some 320,000 deaths, which will then be followed by Chile with about 600 dead, while in Turkey about 55 dead will be counted. In the same year, China will again have about 3,020 deaths, according to which Indonesia will again have 520 deaths, and only a month later 20 and 4 months later again 510 deaths caused by strong seaquakes. Iran then follows with about 15 deaths, after which New Zealand will be hit by earthquakes in the next year, which will cause the loss of some 200 people. Then China will again lead the death row with about 30 deaths, after which Japan will be hit by an enormous seaquake and a mega tsunami, which then claims about 18,700 people's lives. Myanmar follows with about 80 deaths, Spain with 10, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan and Uzbekistan with 16 and another India with 123 dead. after which Turkey will have around 800 dead. In 2012 there are again seaquakes in the Philippines, which will claim some 150 dead, as will Indonesia another 25 dead, Italy 22, then Afghanistan about 80, and Iran but about 330 dead. Guatemala will follow with 48 and then Myanmar with 30 deaths. There will be a seaquake of 18 in Indonesia and a death of 17 in the Solomon Islands, and then 40 in Iran and Pakistan and 223 in Afghanistan. Philippines 112 people die. For 2014, only China will have 619 earthquakes, according to which 2015 Nepal will have to complain about another 9,000 and 2 weeks later about 150 dead. Subsequently, in Chile, 14 people are killed by quake activity, after which 461 people are killed again in Afghanistan. These are all the major earthquakes, as well as various seaquakes, which will cause more than 5 people's lives during the 15-year period, but several thousand other seas and earthquakes worldwide during the same period, which sometimes only cause very great destruction, but will not claim a human life. From 2016 and beyond, however, those earthquakes in central Italy and around the world will be followed by severe seaquakes, which will form the beginning of the major disasters and all the predicted disasters that will be accompanied by immense natural catastrophes. Thus, in the coming times, there will also be immense floods and catastrophes unprecedented since the time of human remembrance. But more and more devastating forest fires will take place, but, with the exception of Australia, more in the middle and northern hemisphere of America, Europe and Asia, of which Switzerland will also be affected. Large upheavals due to the waning of the tundra of the Arctic and Antarctic are due to volcanic eruptions all around the world, but also due to the pole displacement which has been going on for several centuries, as is largely the result of the destruction and irreparable destruction and eradication caused by human overpopulation on the planet, nature, all oceans and inland waters, as well as in the atmosphere and the world of plants and animals, and also in the climate. Due to the nature of the geography of the planet, the country, the mountains, the forests, oceans and inland waters, the shifts are only gradual, but unstoppable, with about 85% of the population being unstoppable and irrational overpopulation and their irresponsible destructive and destructive powers. There will henceforth be dissatisfaction all over the world, which will in many cases be due to the US-led, irresponsible Secret Service intrigues, manipulations and military armed conflicts and wars. This, in addition to the fact that in many countries internal armed governmental struggles and power struggles of rival groups will take place, as a result of which increasingly hostile weapons struggles are taking place all over the world and will often continue for several decades. It will emerge that new abuses occur in the governmental systems of various countries, which means that the populations are constantly confronted with new taxes because the responsible persons, the financial leaders in the governments and the powers themselves, do not understand the financial resources and thereby driving their countries into horrendous debts, for which the taxpayers are then made liable with tax increases. But the time will come when people from the people will be appointed government officials, and a purification will be carried out at higher and lower government and office, whereby greater attention will be paid to the well-being of the people, and consideration for the individual man will be taken. This will also result in certain circumstances and changes in political, economic and all other circumstances, which will also lead to equality between the two sexes, as well as a broader understanding of the truly necessary needs of the individual. In the process, interpersonal relations will also be reapplied, which will very quickly stagnate in the course of the next few decades and well into the new millennium, thereby stunning people and losing the value of humanity and true love from their meaning. Thoughts and feelings are cold, indifferent, and thus dull-witted towards the fellow human beings and their problems. This will take place especially from the 1980s, when the new sounds of alleged music are entirely of the same kind and will have nothing to do with harmony and music, for at this time a change to complete disharmony occurs in the consciousness of the people, which will also affect and damage the nerves as well as the entire cognition. In many people, these will ruin the behavioral control system and cause a negative transformation of the information, which seriously damages the whole of the behavior of those who fall into these disharmonic sounds. Everything will lead to many becoming incapacitated, aggressive, indifferent, and unworldly, which will be enough to the end of the self-esteem and self-worth. Because only in the disharmony of the sounds destructive to consciousness is a life seen. In many respects, this leads to distress and misery, as well as to the fact that the fellow human beings are no longer respected, and that they are only encountered with a highly indifferent indifference, and that they are not given any assistance when they are in distress and need help. Contrariwise, everything will lead people to become self-destructive and self-destructive in themselves, as a result of complete dissatisfaction with themselves. And this will also affect the attitude towards fellow human beings, by breaking relations with them and by completely ignoring their well-being as a result of intercitableness. This will result in a radical malignity which will be grounded in thoughtlessness, carelessness, negligence, carelessness, inattentiveness, carelessness, 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 irresponsibility and inattention, hacked, brutally abused, beaten, robbed and even beaten. The time of these events, however, will also be the one to which the negative effects of the progressive overpopulation will be exposed in the way the law of nature will unfold its rules in such a way that many people are harmed in their consciousness and body be taken. From the 1960s onwards, a major problem will begin to affect the overpopulation people, making them suffering and vulnerable to many serious and often incurable diseases. The Great Plague is that more and more cancer diseases and many forms of allergies, which even life-threatening stages are assumed, are caused by an overcrowding and softening of mankind. A wide-reaching immunodeficiency affects very many people, and this will then continue well into the new millennium. As a result of the increasing overpopulation, it will also come to the effect that human health will be affected by impairments of consciousness and a general weakness of the intelligentsia, which will make people dulled against reality, become irrational, stupid and slow. These changes will come, that is certain, and there will be no longer any evolution or revolution for the better for the most part of earthly life, for which a great deal of religious thought is to be blamed because this is not reality and truth, but falsehood and unreality. The basis of reality and truth will be grasped only when the great and unavoidable catastrophes come and call into question the further existence of the entire Earth's humanity. There will be no divinity then, but only the reality and truth to which every individual person must be directed and lived, and this will be the basis of what all the 6 prophets of the doctrine of the prophets of Enoch, Elijah, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Emmanuel to Muhammad and now taught by you. All the teachers taught, and the last also teaches to the present time, that when the sun reaches its highest activity in the coming time, the change to the modern era after 1844 brings unprecedented progress in all fields of earthly human achievements of good, but also of evil, and this leads to gradual, crass changes in every respect. The whole brings a gradual catastrophic activity in the coming time. It will not be the way ignorant ones ironically think that human life will continue as before, when all the changes come as they are foreseen. It will also be that certain occurrences will not be gradual but sudden, and consequently the coming changes will be of a different nature. The seeds for this have been sown by earthly humanity by the continual increase of the overpopulation, and now they germinate and will now grow and harvest their evil fruits of irresponsibility, destruction, devastation and extermination over the coming years and decades, with new seeds, which are again spread out and sown. And as regards the event of the migration of the poles, this will also contribute to the transformation of the planet and the conditions of life, and to the needs of earthly humanity, which will cause shifts in the north of the European continent. And it is certain that all things will come, but also the consequences of the migration of the poles. Of the pole jump can be survived, but certain areas will become dangerous areas where survival will hardly be possible. Through the period of the migrations of the poles there will be tremendous, universal shocks and changes, which will destroy a great part of earthly humanity, to many natural and irresponsible, destructive and exterminating excesses. As already explained, unusually large earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, mountain falls and floods are of great proportions, as also in the seas tremendous tidal waves which humanity can no longer oppose. The future new wars triggered by Americans' guilt worldwide, as well as fatal diseases and epidemics, uprisings and civil wars in many countries, and the emergence of several major terrorist organizations and small terrorist groups form the early stage and signal for all in the 3,000th coming events. And it will be that these will gradually follow one another, and may take up to 2/3 of the earthly humanity. These events will inevitably come, and the resulting apocalyptic destruction and devastation will unleash an incredible confusion, especially among human civilized life. The whole coming chaos and disaster in the coming times up to the second and third decade of the third millennium will still appear harmless to what the times will bring. All chaos periods will, however, always follow rebuilding phases, after which, however, destruction will come again and everything will be destroyed again. Some of these events will begin in the coming decades, with Italy soon coming to an end because of the beginning of the coming upheavals, because the main center of the outbreak will be submarine in the Mediterranean and Central Eastern Europe. 2002 and 2009 serious earthquakes, and then from 2016 and 2017 a series of earthquakes will announce the coming events. From there, about 5 countries will be affected by the devastating destruction and devastation, and partly sinking into the sea. The whole will also extend to the Irish, Icelandic, and Western European coasts, and especially the low-lying British coasts. The great upheavals will induce a large part of mankind to escape the false faith in religions, sects, and an imaginary God in order to reflect the return to reality and truth, and to return to the knowledge of the natural creative values with their thoughts and their consciousness. The coming times will bring very sad things into the new millennium, including the worst of all evils, that are falling from the knowledge of the truth of the natural creative, and thus from the reality and the truth, and again falsely increasing beliefs. The darkness of faith and ignorance will be preferred to the light of clear knowledge. How many of the earth's human beings will find that death is better than life, which is why, unintentionally and unscrupulously, they are massacred by death organizations and also will commit suicide. Only a few will seek for truthful truth, for they will abduct the seducers, who, with religious and sectarian phrases, will seduce men into a confused belief in a God. Every rational man who does not believe, but knows the true truth of reality, will be thought crazy, but the believer of God is mistaken for wise. In the coming times, trustworthy people will be cursed as long awaited as far into the future, while ones other than trustworthy will be highly praised. And this will come more and more in the middle of the coming 1970s. Speakers, journalists, missionaries, recruiters and public media and lecturers will appear and publicly spread lies and slander about true truths to kill them and lead the peoples into misery and untruth through deliberate lies. And when people are discussing important questions and wanting to receive correct answers in order to become truly knowledgeable about reality and to know the truth, then, as from an old age, they have been misled by lies and the path of the truthless religious and sect beliefs. The future of earthly humanity also looks gloomy in the way that women and men give unconscionable descendants and bring them into the world, but they no longer care for them, and they turn them into criminals, and those who are incapable of life and society children. Many infertile women will be irresponsible by artificial means to produce progeny in themselves, though they can bear no responsibility for them and cannot educate them, and with which they will also increase the irresponsible population. Jealousy, greed, oppression, and strife will become day-to-day tasks in marriage and families. Lies and calumnies about truth will generally become prevalent, and many unscrupulous people, in their thoughts and feelings, as well as in their psyche, will be driven into need and misery and even suicide or murder. Some countries are desecrated because desertification, a progressive desert formation, is happening, which is constantly caused by a worsening of the soil in relatively dry areas and has already taken place for a long time. This desertification is due to various factors, including the climate change that has been going on for several centuries, but in a great way primarily through human activities. The degradation of soil caused by human beings in a new period, and also in the future, is caused by the formation and rapid spread of deserts or desert-like conditions. Most of the desertification is preceded by the formation of steppes, which means that the earth is already losing 2 million hectares of fertile land every year, which will increase to about 15 million hectares by the year 2020. The destructive work of mankind, which contributes greatly to desertification, is the unreasonable deforestation of the general forests, the soils of which, after a few years, become stunted, become sterile, are leached and lead to desertification. In the same way, this will be done with the floodplain forests and floodplains, in order to build human dwellings on their ground. In the coming decades, too, completely incorrect methods of irrigation will be applied, which will destroy as much fertile cultivated land as by the horrendous construction of roads and other roads, as well as by the construction of immensely many dwellings for the endlessly growing and ultimately all-destructive growing overpopulation, by which, in addition to the agricultural overgrazing of the cultivated land, an immense occupation of every cultivated land will take place, which then also leads to desertification. Anarchy, bloodshed, and violence in families, and on the streets, will bring to daily life and much horror and mischief. Many offspring are the cause of great annoyances, grief, brawls, abuse, and anxiety in families, on the streets, in schools, in workplaces and in the public. Many offspring are born out of the country, and their fathers are not acquainted with one another, because children and adolescents will be operated by both sexes at a young age. Many people fall victim to a lack of intelligence and a sense of reason, which they try to make their way through mockery, chatter, and much nonsensical criticism of everything and everyone, as well as alcoholism and hallucinations. In many people, inhumanities, distortions, adulterations, nursemaids, fictions and lies are boosted in the absence of real knowledge and lack of knowledge as a substitute for knowledge. People will enter into connections with strangers, indifferent to the connections with their own family, their other neighbors and their partners, will break off contact with them, but will also allow them to be neglected and slandered. Hypocrites will gain the upper hand against all honest men and gain control over the affairs of the fellow human beings and the commonwealth, whereby wicked and corrupt, degenerate men will conduct all sorts of business, sects, associations, organizations, etc. Criminals and violent criminals, as well as malicious and psychopathic people of all kinds, will rapidly increase in consequence of the rapid increase in the overpopulation and the general decay of earth life, and will bring much evil and disaster. In all the coming times, people will continue to neglect their thoughts, emotions, and the psyche in the coming ages, which will lead to the greatest depravity of earthly humanity as it has never before been. A great many men become indifferent, conscienceless, thoughtless, and insensible creatures, who torture, murder, and slay like bloodthirsty beasts, and thirst for the blood of their fellow men, because their senses are darkened for the good and the living, revenge, egoism, envy and lies, slander, and ongoing warfare and terrorism. Many dictators will be overthrown, as the crowns of the emperors and kings will fall. In various countries of the world, in consequence of useless, power-loving rulers and their rulerships, aggravated fighting operations and murderous actions on the populations will be carried on in the country's own lands, by means of guerrilla groups or by fanatical and religious gangs. And the future shows that whole nations will die by wars and acts of terror, as well as by hunger, lack of water, and violent crimes. And it will be as bad as it was unthinkable in the world. As a result, innumerable persecuted persons, who will be as many as 350 million, are going to crisscross the world and seek life security. And this fact will draw the attention of the whole world. All roads and wheeled vehicles will be filled with masses of fleeing from one place to the next, while the smallest, largest, and most beautiful villages and cities will be burned and destroyed by bombs, rockets, and fire. And it will be terrible how families are torn apart, scattered, and their members killed, a good knowledge and true love disappearing, and also the world empty. Earth people will become more and more terrible war actions, hatred and selfishness, revenge and retaliation, and indifference, pursuing one another as a result of enmity, and building an ideology of the materialism that is ever worst on earth. And there will be unconscionable barbarians who follow this ideology and shrink from nothing to indulge their vice. Every means will be right, even to slander and murder, in order to gain wealth, for they will think that there is nothing that cannot be conquered or cannot be obtained, if only greed be enough. The future of earthly humanity brings a progress of absolute evil, which can only be stopped by an unprecedented catastrophe, which alone the planet itself and nature can evoke. And this catastrophe will be triggered by the consequences of the immeasurable destruction, extinction and extermination arising from the criminal machinations of the overpopulation. These forces are triggered by the hands of the egoists and corrupters of earthly humanity, for they themselves are the instruments of the most abominable crimes against the human's earth, as well as of nature, the planet, the water, and the world of all fauna and flora. When earthly humanity has reached the climax of its physical intelligence, and its civilization has been raised to the highest possible level, it will be absolutely incapable of progressing in the good because it simply stands still, and can make no progress at all. The fact is that if Earth life does not change for the better and good, and the overpopulation does not stop, then it will destroy itself. In order to prevent this, it is necessary that a new awareness arise and be introduced. This doctrine alone is that which can, when it is obeyed, soothe the nations, and lead them into a new world. Only through the observance of this doctrine can there be a peaceful world which will be freed from the old hatred and discontent. The disagreements, morbid opinions, false principles and actions will be accepted in earthly humanity, which will lead many people to become sad victims of their own desires and fall into their egoism, which is particularly true in the first 3 decades of the first 2 decades will be expressed. And when, in the second decade of the new millennium in Germany, large numbers of refugees from Arabia, Africa, and Asia are called forth by the rulers, by their morbid irrationality and their disturbance of consciousness, many hordes and racial hatred will break out in many groups and organizations. The xenophobia and racism, as well as murderous terror, will demand a great deal of human life, as will demonstrations of foreign and anti-racist demonstrations, especially against refugees. In the process, too, there will always be violent acts, because right-wing ideas are widespread, especially because of the nonsensical fugitive streams that are coming to Europe and which are triggered irresponsibly by the German ruler. It will be alarming that alien xenophobia and xenophobia will occur in all social strata, which will create a dangerous dimension for all refugees and asylum seekers. Refugees are subjected to right-wing extremist crimes, set on fire and destroyed, with the result that human beings are also harmed and even the death of the refugees will be accepted. Foreigner and racist acts of violence, as well as hatred of asylum seekers and refugees, are, unfortunately, part of everyday life. Asylum, xenophobia and racism are by no means only people who, as members of right-wing extremist groups and terrorist organizations, will engage in racial hatred. There will also be demonstrations of normal citizens against refugee homes, with right-wing extremists also joining forces with the alleged concerned citizens. In the coming period of the first 2 decades of the third millennium, the world will experience the greatest refugee crisis and the largest asylum attack since the Third World War, which ended in 1945. And as already explained, the German ruler will be responsible, who will be harmed in the consciousness, err and confused, and is still spurred by her fascinated followers. More than 1.5 million people will be fleeing to Europe, asylum seekers in Germany, Switzerland, and the dictatorship union countries, including many labor crimes, parasites, criminals and violent criminals, as well as terrorists. At the same time, the numbers of right-wing extremes as well as of criminal acts of violence are also increasing in Europe. In doing so, all righteous refugees and asylum seekers will be the target for all those who are already dissatisfied, as well as for those who are fiercely aristocratic and racist, who, as it were, represent refugees and righteous asylum seekers and refugees as scapegoats for those who, criminals, rapists, terrorists, and so on. However, the legitimate refugees and asylum seekers will not be able to defend themselves because they are not familiar with the authorities, customs in the European countries, and will not be able to master the language. In particular, in the new millennium, foreigners, asylum seekers and refugees in Europe, especially in Germany, will be widespread. This is because many locals want to defend their privileges, ruthlessly, because they will believe to come too short, and that someone wants to take something away from them. For this reason, hatred will be directed against the legitimate refugees and asylum seekers, who are in need of special protection, and which will indeed be in need of protection. Many Europeans will doubt that refugees are being in their homeland, which is why they will refuse to be generous to those who are truly persecuted by war. Particularly in Germany, the characteristics of foreigners, strangers, assailants and racism, as well as anti-Semitism and right-wing extremist attitudes, will again grow strongly in the new millennium. In the process, the opinion that foreigners, strangers, refugees and asylum seekers in Europe would only be able to take advantage of the welfare state will begin to ramp up, but this will in fact only apply to those who are unjustified. In the future, many people will be victims of their own dishonesty and addictions, as well as their lust for vengeance and retribution, and many are driven away from their possessions and ultimately even killed. Separation, flight, fear, hatred, harmlessness, distress, misery, greed, death, and many changes will appear everywhere, and there will be no real certainty anywhere. Women and girls are raped, kidnapped, murdered in the street, while children are kidnapped and sexually abused, killed, or made into labor slaves. The rulers will do little or nothing about it because many of them themselves are involved in whoredom or child abuse, and in dark unlawful trafficking. In politics, their inadequate opinions will diverge, and they will create laws, principles, and decrees that they themselves will not observe, or which will be contrary to them. All they will be concerned solely with their own advantages, whereby the general confusion will increase day by day. This will result in the enmity among the rulers and politicians themselves, and no rational solutions and rules will be found, so that everything rational will be left to be desired and nothing valuable will be achieved. Large and useless or popularly exploiting or popular exploitation decisions are made, taxes are levied and dumb political meetings are held, but unreasonable parties, conspiracies and harmful new connections are created. The bad, domineering, and useless rulers will thrust upwards and gain positions of power, while good government forces, who are good men, will be pushed back or abandoned. Thus, the wrong, bad, and incapable rulers will not have to give trouble to form and shape their plans. The good and righteous in the governments, in politics, and in the parties, are faced with great and insurmountable obstacles which they cannot overcome. It is therefore possible that in the governments, politics, parties and offices of all kinds, as well as in legislation, inhumanity and lack of interest in the welfare of the people will increase, because all will only take care of themselves and those of them or from the misfortunate fellow human being, laughing maliciously, harassing or even curse. As has always been the case, all good alliances, which are closed, will never become reality, while bad alliances and treaties are always fulfilled. Good connections are destroyed by hatred and power, and are made void by great bloodshed. In the end everything will be so hostile and destroyed, as it was at the beginning and before any peaceful decisions. Thus many deaths will continue to hold a rich harvest, and the destruction of human achievements, as well as the destruction and eradication of nature and its plants and creatures of all kinds, will continue as well as through wars, discontent, and terror. However, it will also be the case that many people are carried away by various and more serious diseases, as well as by newly emerging diseases, as they are still breaking out in this century, but also after the change of the millennium Earth, such as the Big Plague, which from 1980 will cost millions of lives worldwide and will exist far into the new millennium, along with other bad diseases. And what will arise among men with regard to epidemics will also be found among animals, as well as among aquatic organisms, among birds, etc., from which also domestic animals, and all kinds of domestic poultry will be affected. As already mentioned, the new times will bring moral corruption and injustice, which will rise to great heights, and will bring much evil and disadvantage. The consequences of the diminished knowledge about reality, the reality and its truth, as well as the general knowledge and the learned knowledge, as well as the disappearance of the intelligentsia, as in the past, will rekindle the falsehoods and false doctrines of the religions and their false morality, and will once more bequeath mankind into their spell. In this way, faith, hatred, revenge and injustice, etc., will re-emerge, instead of righteousness, whereby the naked selfishness, egoism, self-seeking, self-interest, interests, and the self-sole basis of faith, as has been the case since time immemorial. In this way, the bonds of love against fellow human beings will dissolve, which is contrary to all the virtues which are made to laugh, and the righteousness and rights of the people are made mocking by the ruling, powerful, and civilized, and strange and unexpected official, governmental, and governmental orders, regulations, laws, taxes, decrees, and resolutions, etc., will lead to great riots, revolts, demonstrations, and bloody violence among the peoples, and cause much disaster. Thus the nearer, farther and farther future of the earth and earthly humanity will be as invariably from the foresight, or from the prophecies inserted, if these are not changed for the better and the good.